Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on this new episode of our podcast. Today, I'm alone. It's just going to be me, Maureen, talking about something very specific for my final project in journalism class. So, I got the opportunity to interview two people. The first one being one of my very close friends. He is a French student at Sciences Po. He's studying war journalism, while he's trying to, become a war reporter. Something that I wanted to do when I was younger, as you'll discover during this episode. His name is Paul Lacoste. He's a very dear friend of mine. And the second person that I interviewed is actually my professor. Hi, professor. You'll be listening to this to grade me. So this is my professor, Thomas Lensner. I will try to give a little bit of context, and you will find some actually in this episode because everybody will try to introduce themselves accordingly. This being said, thank you so much for listening to this very special episode, and I hope that you will like this concept. So thank you so much, and on with the episode. Thank you so much for joining me today on my podcast. I'm glad to have with me one of my fellow comrades from Sciences Po. Can you please introduce yourself to the podcast so that the people know who you are and what it is that you do at Sciences Po?
Okay, so thank you for your invitations. I'm currently a master's student at Sciences Po, specializing in journalism and public affairs. Alongside my studies, I'm doing an internship at the Washington Post, where I have been able to observe how an international newsroom covers major political and geopolitical issues.
So I do have a few questions for you today. The main goal being that I want to compare your experience because you are new to this field. You don't have you do have some sort of experience, but then I want to compare it with the one of a well-seasoned journalist, being my professor in this podcast. So I do have a few questions for you, if that's okay. Okay. So the first one being, what actually made you want to report on conflicts and on war specifically, rather than any other type of journalism?
I think war reporting is one of the most essential forms of journalism, because it forces us to confront reality when governments, armies, or social networks often try to simplify or distort it. But paradoxically, that doesn't always mean we understand them better. I want to work in this field because I believe journalism still has a democratic function, documenting facts, giving visibility to civilians, and preserving a form of truth in moments where truth itself becomes contested.
Yeah, and in what sense would you say that truth becomes, somewhat contested nowadays? Does it have to do with social media, or what's your experience with it?
The rumors spread faster than verified facts, and there is an enormous pressure to be first instead of being accurate. And there is also this challenge of trust. Many audiences today are skeptical of traditional media, and I think that's a huge challenge for us.
Would you say that you, as, this sort of specific media consumer, but also at the same time this media producer, because you want to be a journalist, you are exposed to this? Like, can you see to what extent there is this constant conflict in the media to, on the one side, be telling a sort of reality, and on the other side, being there first and trying to shape the news as it comes and as it goes?
I think I face the same pressures as everyone else in today's media environment. The pressure to react instantly, to follow breaking news in real time, and sometimes to prioritize speed over depth. But my experience in journalism has made me much more aware of the risks. that come with this logic, especially in the context of conflicts or political crisis. I do believe journalists should privilege accuracy over being first. Publishing incorrect or insufficiently verified information can have major consequences, particularly online where misinformation spreads extremely quickly. That is why I think it is essential to cross-check sources, provide references whenever possible, or clearly distinguish verified facts from speculation, I would say. And this approach is close to what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu described when criticizing the acceleration of television journalism and the pressure of immediacy, which can weaken critical thinking and verification. It also echoes the work of Hannah Arendt, who explained that factual truth is fragile in political life and can easily be distorted by propaganda or mass communication.
I do like the theory that you kind of, invoked in here. I do, however, want to take a sort of distance with this to ask you a more personal question on this personal motivation of yours and how you first decided that you wanted to become a war journalist. Is it something that struck you in the press, in the media, or is it something more personal that made you want to work in that field?
I think for me, it started with frustration, actually. I remember following conflicts and feeling like I never really understood what was going on. Every source seemed to tell a different story, and I couldn't tell what was true or what was missing. And then at some point I realized that for most people, the confusion just turns into indifference. You scroll, you see something terrible, and then you move on. And that really bothered me. I don't come from a place that experienced war directly, so I've always been aware that I'm on the outside. But I think that's always why I'm drawn to it, because there's this gap between what people live and what we understand from far away. I guess I want to try to reduce that gap even a little, not in a naive way. I know you can't ever fully capture reality, but just to make things a little bit clearer, more human, less abstract. And yeah, it scares me, and I don't think you want to do this without being a bit scared. But I think that's also what makes it feel important, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really like your last sentence, this idea of fear, because we talked a lot in class that actually fear, it was really important to the work of journalists because it makes you want to go get the news, but at the same time, you need to reach the right level. Otherwise, you are just, trapped in your anxiety. But on the other hand, you can just go too far and put yourself at risk. So I think the notion of fear, it has to be present, and I quite like what you said. But my question for you is rather, what actually makes you really afraid? Like, what's your biggest fear, I guess, in war reporting?
I think my biggest fear would be getting it wrong, not just factually, but in the way I tell the story. Misrepresenting something or simplifying it too much, especially when it's about people whose reality I can fully understand. And at the same time, I also be afraid of the opposites, of being too present in what I write, letting my own emotions, my perspective take up too much space to the point where the story becomes more about me than about what's actually happening. So it's this tension, I guess, between wanting to be accurate and fair, but also knowing that you're never completely invisible as a journalist. And I think that balance is something I'd find really difficult.
And I want to ask you this question. What kind of war reporter do you actually hope to become? Someone who actually documents, someone who explains, or someone who actually, and I think you talked a little bit about this, who tries to really make an impact?
I'd probably say someone who explains. Because documenting is essential, you need that record. But on its own, I feel like I can leave people at a distance, and trying to make an impact can be tricky. Because there's always the risk of imposing your own narrative on something that's not yours. What really matters to me is helping people understand, giving context, showing how things connect, why something is happening, and what it means for the people living through it. I think explanation is what can turn information into something people actually engage with. And if there's any impact, I'd want it to come from that, rather than from trying to push a specific reason.
My next question has to do with what you just said. Do you think that the way journalism works now has really evolved in the recent years, and that actually the way things need to be reported right now is very different to what it was before?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, yes, of course.
Yes. Yes, of course. I think it's hard for it not to, even if you try to keep a certain distance, you carry things with you. It changed the way I see everyday life. The things that feel urgent or important shift. You become more aware of how fragile situations are, how quickly things can unravel, but also of how people adapt and keep going in ways you wouldn't expect. I also think it changes how you listen. You become more focused to what's said and what isn't, to the gaps, to the silences. And I do think what your course describes as journalist trauma or even moral injury really resonates here. This idea that you're not just witnessing events, but that you are affected by them in a deeper, sometimes ethical way. There's always that tension. You want to do justice to what you've seen, but you can never fully convey it. And that awareness stays with you in the end.
I would imagine. I'm sure you've read this, the Manufacturing Consent, written by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky as a journalist major. But do you remember how they argue that media coverage is actually shaped by structural filters like sourcing, ownership, ideology? And would you say that those kinds of constraints are at play in conflict reporting today?
Yes. I think those dynamics are still very much present. Even if they look a bit different today, in conflict reporting, access and sourcing are probably the most visible. Journalists often depend on military briefings, government officials, or a limited set of voices on the ground. And that shapes the story, not necessarily because of intentional bias, but because of who is available and credible and considered credible, I would say. At the same time, I think the system has become more complex. with social media and independent reporting, there are more voices. But that doesn't necessarily mean more clarity. In some ways, the filters are less centralized. They're still there. They're just multiplied. So I wouldn't say manufacturing consent is outdated. If anything, it helps us see that even in the more fragmented media environment, the conditions under which information is produced still matter a great deal.
Yeah, and I think it's basically what we said in class. So I definitely resonate with what you just said. I do want to talk about the concept of worthy victims. This is something that it's quite recurrent in media framing these days. The idea of there is one side that is worthy of your pity and of you taking action. And as a journalist, which side are you taking? Is it a side, or is it something that as a student you think you will try to part away from? This idea that some lives actually receive more media attention and empathy, and that do you think that there is a kind of hierarchy that still shapes our conflicts or cover today?
I think there's still a clear hierarchy. Some victims are framed as closer, more relatable, or more politically significant, and that shapes how much attention they receive. But I think young journalists need to be aware of these biases. Objectivity is not only about verifying facts. It is always about questioning whose stories are being told, whose suffering is considered politically relevant, and whose voices remain unheard. Good war reporting should try to reduce these blind spots by giving visibility to populations that are often ignored in international media coverage.
So I don't want to take too much of your time, and I think that my final question is going to be, you are still a student. You want to become working, war journalist. I want to know how you see yourself in 10 years, the kind of journalist that you aspire to be. Because at the end of this podcast, I will, give the perspective of my professor and his advice for you. And I want to see if this really resonates with what you're going to say.
In 10 years, I would want to see myself as a war reporter who has learned to balance proximity and restraint. Someone who is present enough to bear witness, but disciplined enough not to let the story become about me. I don't think of war reporting as simply documenting events. It's an act of translation of huge chaos into narrative, of suffering into something that can be understood without being reduced. I hope that by then I will have developed the patience to listen longer than is comfortable, and the ability to accept that some truths cannot be fully captured, only approached. At the same time, I would want to resist the illusion of neutrality that sometimes flatters reality. Most of all, I hope I won't become numb, because the hardest risk in war reporting is not physical danger, but emotional erosion.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Absolutely, this kind of slow normalization of violence. I really want to remain someone who is still disturbed by what they see, because that discomfort is what keeps the reporting honest.
Once again, very complicated to find the right balance. Because if you're numb, then you kind of dissociate from what you see, and reporting is affected by this. But at the same time, if you take it too much at heart, then of course it has like this terrible impact on you, and it's more than just journalism then, because it really permeates your everyday life. And we talked a lot in class about the way, journalists have more resources than ever to go to therapy, to actually talk about their trauma, something that was not present probably during the last decades or so. But I think it's always very complicated to find the right balance, especially when conflicts are so violent and so reported. I want to thank you for your honesty today and for the way you talk to us about what it is to be a student in war journalism. I don't know if you have any last words, but yeah, it was very interesting.
I wanted to thank you for having me today. It was really interesting to reflect on these questions and the role journalism can still play in a world where information moves so quickly and is often contested.
It's the French in you. Yeah.
Thank you again for the opportunity and for the conversation.
Yeah, it was great, and we wish you the best, for your internship and for what comes afterwards. And maybe, who knows, maybe you're gonna come back to this podcast in 20 years and it's going to be you, the professional, and we'll listen to somebody else's experience as a student. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's me again. So now that we've listened to my friend, I want to introduce my professor, Thomas Lenzner. He is a former journalist, foreign correspondent for the London Observer and The Guardian, mainly from the 1980s till the 1990s. So he is now teaching at Sciences Po Paris, where I actually study. And his main class is on perception and politics of conflict coverage. This is mainly a course on media literacy. So I apologize in advance because we were not in the same room when we recorded this. My professor was in Italy and I was in Paris. Therefore, you can see that the recording is not as crisp and as clear as I would have hoped so, but I hope that you can still get some insight from what my professor said, and I really wanted to thank him again for the time he took to talk to me. So thank you so much, Professor, and I will let you speak. Thank you. So to start, I would like to ask you a few questions, a few general ones, but also a few personal ones, if you are comfortable with them. And the first one being, can you actually remember what your first assignment was? Can you jump back to this younger version of yourself when you first started war reporting? When was it? And do you have something that you remember vividly from this experience?
It's a long ago question now.
Yes.
I'll travel back in time. I became a journalist. Really, I reported for my high school newspaper, my university newspaper a bit. But I became a journalist really because I wanted to see the world rather than seeing the world because I became a journalist. So I traveled from Europe through Africa and ended up teaching at a small high school in Swaziland when I ran out of money. But I had always desired to write, and that gave me a great opportunity to travel around Southern Africa. And I visited some of those places. I visited Rhodesia, then what became Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, a few times during the conflict there. And that was perhaps the first time that I wrote about an active conflict from a conflict zone. There was some danger we had to ride in contact. One of the first conflict stories I ever had published was about riding in convoys in what was then Rhodesia, and describing how people, the white people who were ruling the country then, would have to gather in convoys to travel and to safeguard themselves against the resistance, against the rebellion that was trying to end white minority rule.
Okay. Yeah. And when you first reported on this conflict, did your idea of what war reporting was kind of shifted? Was the experience when you faced it really different from what you had imagined in the past?
Thinking about that is important because it reflects on what media I consumed and what media I had taken in during my childhood, my youth, during my university years, and how I saw conflict reporting being offered. And it was certainly something that then shaped how I reported. It also was a fact that I was trying to sell my product to American and other newspapers that expected a certain format in the reporting. The reporting that I did, some of it was because it had to be a little bit different, was at first perhaps less analytical and more observational about how life was, for example, in Rhodesia, about how it was to ride in a convoy, how it felt like, what the people were experiencing, how they were acting. And it wasn't about as much then an overall geopolitical situation. So it was very much my experience on the ground, what I saw and what I was observing about the people around me, that perhaps made those reports more interesting to American media and eventually other media than the sort of reports that you would receive in a wire service about the overall political or economic situation.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, actually, that's kind of make me think of, because when I was younger, I also really wanted to be a war journalist. It was the goal for a very, very long time. And then I realized that maybe it would be too complicated for me, apart from family reason, because my mom was terrified when I first told her about this. But it would be...
I didn't tell my mom.
Yeah, exactly. I think that would have been the right move for me. I was also very scared that I would not be able to find like the right voice to actually report on what was happening and what I was witnessing, because I feared that there would be a sort of discrepancy, and I didn't want to be responsible of that. I wanted other people to do it because I feared that I would not be up to the task. Have you ever felt something like that?
I think I have. It wasn't in that moment, for example, in Rhodesia or in Swaziland. I saw some riots and covered them, relatively small matters. Later on, when I was reporting from Uganda, it was a much more serious conflict, and there were a lot of abuses. There were attacks going on, and to sort out the facts from the rumors and the fiction, and also some moments to believe that I was actually seeing what I was seeing.
Yeah,
was a bit difficult, and it entailed some more personal danger. For example, in Rhodesia, riding in the convoy, you're subjected to a collective danger of being with people who might be subject to attack. When I was in Uganda, it was that I was reporting in a way that was making the authorities very angry and could subject me to personal attack and personal danger beyond the fact of being in a conflict zone where anybody might be injured. And so there was more pressure. There was more pressure from myself to perform well, but also pressure from the media outlets who had different perspectives on the conflict in the country, and sometimes pressed me to report in a way that fit some of their editors' positions.
Yeah, and have you actually faced a sort of situation where reporting the truth could have caused more harm, or was it always clear in your mind what was right to say and what was not?
I did not really face that in most moments. There were very much smaller moments where that could have been a possibility. Someone I knew was arrested, and detained by the military. This was in Uganda. And I heard he had escaped, but it wasn't clear. And then somebody else told me he was dead. And I thought, well, if he escaped and I report that it's believed he escaped, the military will be looking for him.
Yeah.
If I report that he was dead, maybe they would stop looking for him if they were receiving my reports, which sometimes came back via wire services and on the BBC, for which I was reporting also. So I reported that he was dead, according to family sources.
Okay.
And this was what some family told me, that he was dead. So it was not a lie, but a perhaps fuller and more complete report would be that other sources said he had escaped.
Mm-hmm.
But I decided to omit that from the report because it might have caused him harm.
Yeah. Actually, talking about emotional responses, we talked a lot in the class about writers like Susan Sontag and the way, they have argued that repeated exposure to images of suffering can sort of dull out your emotional response. Do you think that's what's happening today? And that this image still have a sort of power to mobilize people, or that we reach the point where it's just too much and that, we're just so closed off that we cannot even see what's happening outside of, our Western reality?
Of course, that's an important question, and we talk about quote-unquote compassion fatigue, or that, as Marshall McLuhan said, that vigilance creates apathy. Eternal vigilance causes apathy. But I believe what we're seeing, because of the immediacy of the images coming through on TikTok or Threads or Instagram, is unmediated and so very real that it's affecting people perhaps more and getting through to people. And it's coming through on their feeds day after day after day after day, which we would not see on mainstream media, and certainly the legacy media. We might see some of it, but a lot of it will also be sanitized. So especially for younger generations that are using social media platforms to receive information and news, perhaps it's in fact more mobilizing than desensitizing.
Do you think that we are actually entering a new era of conflict reporting, or that it's simply a sort of technological extension of older information wars?
Well, it is both, in fact. When people talk about cognitive warfare, it's just a new word for propaganda, which has existed for millennia. But it's easier to do. It's faster. It's more broader, and the concept of user-generated content can be either reputable, credible news and information that's eventually verifiable, or it can be most ideologically driven, chauvinistically driven, racially hatred-driven lies and propaganda. It's much easier to create information content that looks realistic.
Yeah.
Sometimes that being available, accessible, and locatable, as we saw with Marie Colvin, who was sending satellite phone reports from Syria and was discovered by the Syrian government and essentially assassinated by artillery. So there is a cost to this immediacy. So something can be reported, and it might be then, I think as we mentioned in class, on the public record.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the media house might say, well, we reported that, it's on the public record. But unless it's reported again and again and again, it doesn't rise to be on the public agenda. Something that people give more attention to and might raise with their public officials, or the public officials, the policymakers may then become more concerned with the public opinion that might be detrimental to their policies. And they might change their policies, or at least ameliorate the worst parts of them, or engage in perhaps more conflict resolution than conflict making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's make me think about the notion of objectivity as we talked a lot. But I remember reading, the critics like Glenn Greenwald argued that the notion of objectivity can actually obscure underlying biases. In conflict reporting, would you say that objectivity is still today a meaningful goal, or should journalists aim instead of objectivity for transparency about, perspective? If that makes sense.
Well, first, I'd like to, I think can evict that word objectivity.
Yes.
Let's take it out of our vocabulary, because objectivity means that we have a God's eye view and we know everything. What's really important is that we strive for impartiality.
Yes.
Which means being as honest, as complete, as full in our reporting as we can. And some people, Greenwald, has very strong certain perspectives, and if he's transparent about them, that's great as well. What we have to do is recognize that we all carry ideological, cultural, other baggage that reflect our upbringing, reflect our knowledge, reflecting our affinities. If we recognize that, we can bring that to our reporting and strive for impartiality, which is allowing all sides to have voice, but not necessarily giving them equal voice, which would be neutrality, which means you can't make any judgments. But we must make judgments, and we should make judgments about which voices are credible, which voices should carry more weight in the situation, and importantly, which voices typically in mainstream media and legacy media or from certain ideologically driven media are not allowed voice.
Yeah. Retrospectively, you think you managed to do that correctly?
I certainly strove for that. I tried to find voices that weren't always included. My own background from university was studying history and political science and wars of liberation and national uprisings. And I had a personal tendency to favor the underdog.
Yeah.
That's something that was built into me. I sought people who had different perspectives and people who were typically marginalized and tried to bring their voices into my reporting.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that you reached the point where you can actually recognize how your own background shaped the way, you reported on specific, conflicts. And what's great with this podcast is that I wanted to show that there is actually this person behind, and all the choices that are made when reporting, they are made out of, a certain background, or because the person, is experiencing a conflict differently or in a more intense way. Your course ends, and our podcast will as well end with the idea that all readers are editors. To what extent do you think that the audience is responsible for the kinds of conflict narratives that dominate today?
The audience has responsibility, one would hope, to be informed, to have some knowledge about the world and have some context that they can judge the reporting that they're receiving. And yet a lot of people know nothing about Ecuador or Equatorial Guinea or Brunei, and they only receive the news. The media that we consume should offer us more context about situations, whether a country was a colony, was affected by other wars, whether this has affected it. But in most short-form news, there's simply not the space to do that.
Yeah.
What one would hope that readers would take more responsibility by informing themselves more generally about the world. The faith narratives, and it's the large F of religions that shape our perceptions sometimes, or the small f of things that we take without evidence. And those can certainly shape how we view the world, how we receive information, how we might then stereotype certain people, places, countries, or not question the narratives that we're being supplied. Some willingness, at least some skepticism, if not cynicism, about the information we receive is necessity, especially in an era of social media where the information is so fragmented and so much harder to verify than before.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good advice, even for the audience. Final question for you: if you could actually speak to your younger self before your first assignment, what would you tell him?
What would I tell him? That's a very good question. I think I would tell him, hey, be a little more careful, which is what older correspondents told me then. But as a young person, as most young people, I was overconfident. I believed I was invulnerable, immortal, and I could handle every situation. I think I pretty quickly realized that, and perhaps I did know that already, especially after living through, as a young person, the Vietnam War, where we were being lied to by our governments and sometimes our media as well. The other thing is the essential importance of having local informants, local knowledge, real knowledge on the ground, and the prime importance of engaging with local media and local academics and people on the ground.
Maybe this will help someone along the way, and I'll be sure to actually make my friend listen to this so that he knows what he's up against. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. And maybe somehow that's the strange thing about journalism, podcasts, and conversations in general. You start with questions, hoping for answers, and somehow you end up with even better and more questions. So thank you all for listening. Thank you to my professor, Thomas Mansner, for surviving this interrogation. And remember, as Hannah Arendt once wrote, speech is actually what makes us human, which means that after all of this time, you probably feel more human than ever. Thank you so much, and have a really great rest of your day or night, depending on where and who you are. Thank you!